The rain fell over Chicago like a gray curtain, turning the city into a watercolor of blurred lights and wet pavement. It was one of those October nights when the wind cut through jackets and the streets emptied early, leaving only the desperate and the determined to walk beneath the storm. Officer Daniel Mercer was neither desperate nor particularly determined that night. He was simply tired. 12 years on the force had taught him that most shifts ended the same way, with paperwork, cold, coffee, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. But this night would be different. This night would change everything he thought he knew about power, about justice, and about the woman who would turn his entire world upside down. Daniel sat in his patrol car on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Adams, watching the rain trace patterns down his windshield. His partner, a younger officer named Marcus Webb, scrolled through his phone in the passenger seat, occasionally laughing at something on the screen. They had been assigned to monitor a jewelry store that had reported suspicious activity earlier in the week, but nothing had happened. Nothing ever happened on nights like this. The wealthy shoppers had retreated to their penthouses, and the streets belonged to the rain. She appeared from nowhere. One moment the sidewalk was empty, and the next, a woman was walking directly toward them, her heels clicking against the wet concrete with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. She wore a cream-colored coat that fell just below her knees, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple twist that exposed the elegant line of her neck. She carried no umbrella, yet she walked through the storm as if the rain had agreed to spare her. There was something about the way she moved that made Daniel sit up straighter, something that triggered an instinct he could not name. Marcus noticed her too. He lowered his phone and whistled low under his breath. The woman did not look at them. She walked past the jewelry store, past the closed boutiques, and turned into an alley that Daniel knew led to a back entrance of one of the oldest buildings in the area. It was a building that had been under investigation for months, though no one had ever found enough evidence to move forward with charges. The department called it a dead end. Daniel called it a feeling. He opened his car door before he realized what he was doing. Marcus called after him, asking where he was going, but Daniel was already walking, his boots splashing through the puddles that had formed along the curb. He did not know why he followed her. He only knew that something was wrong, that something about this woman did not fit the scene, that she moved like someone who owned the night itself. The alley was darker than he expected. A single light flickered above a metal door, casting shadows that danced and shifted with each gust of wind. The woman stood before that door, her hand raised as if she had been about to knock. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, and Daniel saw her face for the first time. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost dangerous, with high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that were the color of aged whiskey. Those eyes met his without surprise, without fear, without anything at all. She simply looked at him as if she had been expecting him all along. Daniel flashed his badge, more out of habit than necessity. He asked her what she was doing there, why she was standing in the rain in a back alley at nearly midnight on a Tuesday. She smiled, and something in that smile made his chest tighten. She said she was waiting for a friend. She said she had gotten lost. She said the rain had caught her off guard. Every answer was reasonable, yet none of them felt true. He should have let her go. There was no law against standing in an alley, no crime in being beautiful and mysterious and utterly calm in the face of a police officer's questions. But Daniel had survived. 12 years on the force by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming at him now, telling him that this woman was not what she appeared to be. He asked for her identification. She reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, as if she wanted him to see every movement. Her fingers emerged holding a driver's license that identified her as Eleanor Vance, 34 years old, with an address in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Elena Vance. The name meant nothing to Daniel. He ran it through dispatch and received nothing but a clean record, not even a parking ticket. She was, according to every database available to him, exactly what she appeared to be, a wealthy woman with good taste and bad timing. but something still felt wrong. There was a weight to her presence, a gravity that pulled at the edges of his perception. She watched him with those whiskey-colored eyes, and he felt as if she could see straight through him, past his uniform and his badge, and all the years he had spent trying to be a good man in a broken city. Marcus arrived at his side, out of breath and annoyed. He wanted to know what was going on, why Daniel had left the car, why they were standing in the rain interrogating a woman who looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. Daniel did not answer. He could not answer because he did not know himself. He only knew that he could not let her walk away, that if he let her disappear into the night, he would never forgive himself. The decision came to him in a flash, like lightning illuminating a darkened room. He told her she was under arrest. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and even as he spoke, he knew they were wrong. He had no grounds, no evidence, nothing but a feeling that coiled in his stomach like a snake. Elena did not protest. She did not argue or demand a lawyer or ask what she was being charged with. She simply extended her wrists, and the smile never left her face. Marcus looked at Daniel as if he had lost his mind. He asked what the charges were, what possible reason they had to arrest this woman who had done nothing but stand in the rain. Daniel muttered something about trespassing, about suspicious behavior, about a tip they had received earlier in the week. It was thin, barely enough to justify the handcuffs that now circled Elena's slender wrists. But it was done. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. They drove to the station in silence. Elena sat in the back seat, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She did not look at Daniel through the rearview mirror. She did not look at anything at all. She simply sat there, still and composed, as if she were being driven to a dinner party rather than a police station. Daniel found himself glancing at her reflection again and again, trying to find some crack in her facade, some sign that she was nervous or angry or afraid. But there was nothing. She was a statue carved from ice and secrets. At the station, Daniel processed her himself. He took her fingerprints, her photograph, her belongings. She cooperated with everything, answering questions in a voice that was soft and measured and revealed absolutely nothing. When he asked her again why she had been in that alley, she told him the truth. She said she owned the building. She said she had been there to check on a property she was developing. She said she had done nothing wrong. Daniel felt the first stirrings of doubt. He pulled up the property records on his computer and found that she was telling the truth. The building was owned by a holding company called Vance Holdings, and Elena Vance was listed as the primary shareholder. He had arrested a woman for standing outside her own property. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had made a mistake, a terrible, career-ending mistake. But before he could say anything, before he could apologize or release her or try to salvage what was left of his dignity, the door to the station swung open. Chief Harold Morrison walked in, his face red from the cold and his eyes sharp with something Daniel could not identify. The chief was a large man with gray hair and a presence that filled every room he entered. He had been running the department for 15 years, and he was known for two things: his unwavering commitment to procedure and his legendary temper. Chief Morrison took one look at Elena and stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, for a single heartbeat, Daniel saw something flicker across the chief's face. It was not surprise, it was not anger. It was fear, pure, undiluted fear, the kind that turned strong men into children and made the impossible suddenly real. Elena looked up at the chief, and her smile widened. She said his name, just his first name, Harold, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. The chief said nothing. He stood there, frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. And then he turned and walked out of the station without a word. Daniel watched him go, confusion and dread building in his chest like a storm. He did not understand what had just happened. He did not understand why the chief, a man who had faced down criminals and politicians and everything in between, had looked at this woman as if she were death itself. But he would understand soon enough. By morning, everything would become clear. The night passed slowly. Eleanor was placed in a holding cell, though she made no complaint. She sat on the narrow bench, with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. Daniel could not sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, trying to make sense of the evening's events. He ran searches on Eleanor Vance, on Vance Holdings, on every piece of information he could find. The results were always the same: clean records, legitimate businesses, nothing to suggest anything improper. But there was a pattern, hidden in the data like a shadow beneath the surface of a lake. Vance Holdings owned properties throughout Chicago, dozens of buildings in neighborhoods that Daniel recognized. They were the same neighborhoods where organized activity had been reported for years, the same areas where investigations had stalled and witnesses had disappeared and cases had gone cold. The connection was circumstantial, nothing that would hold up in court, but it was there. Daniel could feel it. Marcus went home around 3 in the morning, shaking his head and muttering about Daniel's paranoia. Daniel stayed. He printed out reports, made notes, built a timeline that stretched back 5 years. The more he dug, the more questions he found. Who was Elena Vance? Where had she come from? And why had Chief Morrison, a man who had never shown fear in his life, looked at her as if she held his fate in her hands? Dawn came slowly, the grey light seeping through the station windows like water through cracks in a wall. Daniel had not slept. His eyes burned, and his coffee had long gone, cold. But he could not stop. He had found something, a thread that led deeper into the maze than he had ever imagined. Vance Holdings was connected to a network of businesses that stretched across the Midwest, a web of shell companies and offshore accounts and real estate transactions that pointed to something much larger than a simple development company. He was about to call his captain when the phone rang. It was dispatch, and the voice on the other end was trembling. Chief Morrison was gone. He had not come home last night. His car had been found abandoned near the waterfront, the engine still running, the driver's door open. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. The chief had simply vanished, as if the night had swallowed him whole. Daniel hung up the phone and looked toward the holding cells. Eleanor Vance sat exactly where he had left her, her posture unchanged, her expression serene. But as he watched, she opened her eyes and looked directly at him, through the bars. Her smile was different now, sharper, more knowing. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The message was clear in her eyes, in the curve of her lips, in the quiet confidence of her stillness. She had known this would happen. She had known from the moment he had placed those handcuffs on her wrists that the chief would disappear, that the world would shift beneath Daniel's feet, that everything he thought he knew was about to crumble. And she had waited, patient and calm, for him to understand. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He was no longer dealing with a simple mistake, a wrongful arrest that could be explained away with apologies and paperwork. He was standing at the edge of something vast and dark, something that had roots in every corner of the city he had sworn to protect, and at the center of it all, sitting in a holding cell with her perfect posture and her knowing smile, was a woman who had just shown him exactly how powerless he truly was. The rain had stopped by then. Outside the station windows, the city was waking up, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred during the night. People walked to work, cars filled the streets, and life continued as it always had. But for Daniel Mercer, nothing would ever be the same. He had stumbled into a world he did not understand, and he had a terrible feeling that there was no way out. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories will take you on emotional journeys that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe now so you never miss a moment. The news of Chief Morrison's disappearance spread through the department like wildfire. By noon, the station was crawling with federal agents, internal affairs investigators, and reporters who had caught wind of the story. Daniel moved through the chaos in a daze, answering questions he barely heard, repeating the same account of the previous night's events over and over again. No one asked about Elena Vance. No one seemed to know she was still sitting in the holding cell, waiting with infinite patience for whatever came next. Detective Sarah Chen was the first to make the connection. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had worked organized operations for most of her career, and she found Daniel slumped in a chair in the break room, staring at the ceiling. She asked him about the arrest, about the woman he had brought in, about why no one had processed her release. Daniel told her everything, starting from the moment he had seen Elena walking through the rain and ending with the look on Chief Morrison's face. Sarah listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that matched Daniel's heartbeat. Then she pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, showing a woman in a cream-colored coat entering a building. The timestamp was 2 years old. The location was a warehouse on the south side that had been connected to multiple investigations, all of which had gone nowhere. The woman in the photograph was Elena Vance. Sarah had been tracking her for years, she explained. Not directly, because no one knew who she was or what she looked like, but through the patterns she left behind. Elena was a ghost, a name whispered in certain circles, a legend that most law enforcement did not believe was real. She was said to be the head of an organization that had no name, a network that controlled half the illegal operations in the Midwest from the shadows. No one had ever been able to prove it. No one had ever been able to find her. And now, Daniel had arrested her by mistake on a random Tuesday night. Daniel felt sick. He asked Sarah what they should do, whether they should call the FBI, whether they should let Elena go before something worse happened. Sarah shook her head. She said that releasing Elena now would be the most dangerous thing they could do. If Elena Vance really was who she was rumored to be, then she had allowed herself to be arrested. She had chosen to be here in this station for reasons they could not yet understand. Letting her go would mean surrendering whatever small advantage they might have. The afternoon passed in tense silence. The federal agents focused on Chief Morrison's disappearance, treating it as a potential kidnapping. They searched his house, his car, his office, looking for any sign of what had happened. They found nothing. It was as if the chief had simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only questions and fear. Daniel kept returning to the holding cell. He would stand outside the bars, watching Elena, trying to understand what she was thinking. She never spoke to him. She never acknowledged his presence. She simply sat there, serene and still, as if she were meditating rather than awaiting her fate. But each time their eyes met, Daniel felt the weight of her gaze, the intelligence behind, the power that radiated from her like heat from a flame. On the second night she finally spoke. Daniel had brought her dinner, a gesture that he could not explain even to himself. She took the tray with a nod of thanks and asked him why he had arrested her. Her voice was curious rather than accusatory, as if she genuinely wanted to understand his reasoning. Daniel told her the truth. He said he did not know why. He said something about her had felt wrong, had triggered every instinct he had. Developed over 12 years on the force. He said he had made a mistake. Elena smiled at that. She said there were no mistakes, only choices that revealed who people truly were. She said that Daniel had chosen to follow her, to arrest her, to keep her here, even when every rational thought told him to let her go. She said that those choices would define him, would shape the rest of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. And then she asked him a question that would haunt him for years to come. She asked him if he was a good man. Daniel did not answer. He could not answer because he did not know. He had always believed himself to be honest, to be fair, to be committed to the law and the people it protected. But standing there, looking at this woman who had brought a police chief to his knees with nothing but her presence, he felt the foundations of his identity beginning to crack. What did it mean to be good in a world where power operated by its own rules? What did it mean to be honest when the truth itself was a weapon? The next morning, Chief Morrison was found, his body washed up on the shore of Lake Michigan, bloated and gray, with no identification and no obvious cause of passing. The medical examiner would later determine that his heart had simply stopped, as if he had been frightened to the point where his body could no longer function. There were no marks, no wounds, no signs of struggle. He had died of terror, pure and simple, though the official report would never say so. The station erupted into controlled panic. Officers who had served under Morrison for years stood in corners, whispering, their faces pale with shock. The federal agents intensified their investigation, pulling records, interviewing witnesses, trying to piece together the chief's final hours. And through it all, Elena Vance remained in her cell, untouched by the chaos, waiting. Sarah pulled Daniel aside and told him they needed to talk. They went to her car, parked 3 blocks, away from the station, where they could speak without being overheard. She had been making calls, she said. She had reached out to contacts in other cities, other departments, people who had spent their careers chasing shadows. The picture they painted was terrifying. Elena Vance, if that was even her real name, had been building her empire for over 2 decades. She had started young, they said, taking over a small operation from a relative who had underestimated her. She had expanded slowly, methodically, absorbing rivals and eliminating threats with a patience that bordered on supernatural. She never appeared in public. She never gave orders that could be traced back to her. She simply existed at the center of a vast web, pulling strings that moved the entire city. The people who worked for her were loyal to the point of death, not because they feared her, though they certainly did, but because she had given them something no one else could: stability. In a world of chaos and betrayal, Elena Vance kept her promises. She protected her people. She rewarded loyalty and punished treachery with equal precision. And in return, they gave her their absolute devotion. Chief Morrison had been one of her assets, Sarah explained. For years he had looked the other way, had buried investigations, had ensured that Elena's operations remained untouched. He had been paid handsomely, but the payment was secondary to the protection. As long as he served her, he was safe. But when Daniel had arrested Elena, when he had brought her into the station in handcuffs, Morrison had panicked. He had broken the cardinal rule of their arrangement. He had shown fear in front of her. Elena did not tolerate weakness. She could not afford to, not in her position. A leader who surrounded herself with weak men was a leader who would eventually be brought down. Morrison had been a valuable asset, but his reaction had revealed him to be a liability. His removal had been swift, silent, and absolute. And now Daniel was left to wonder what his own fate would be. He asked Sarah what they should do. She had no answer. They could not charge Elena with anything, she said. There was no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but rumors and theories that would never hold up in court. They could not release her either, because doing so would be an admission of defeat, a signal to everyone watching that Elena Vance was above the law. They were trapped, caught between 2 impossible choices, and the clock was ticking. That night Daniel went to the holding cell one last time. He stood outside the bars looking at Elena, and he asked her why. Why had she allowed herself to be arrested? Why had she sat here for 3 days, patient and calm, while the world crumbled around her? Why had she not simply walked out, called her lawyers, demanded her release? Eleanor rose from the bench and approached the bars. She was close enough that he could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that seemed utterly out of place in the grim concrete cell. She looked at him with those whiskey-colored eyes, and she told him the truth. She had wanted to see him, not the station, not the chief, not the investigation or the agents or any of the machinery of law enforcement. She had wanted to see Daniel Mercer, the officer who had trusted his instincts over his training, who had acted on a feeling rather than evidence, who had done something that no one had done in 20 years. He had looked at her and seen something wrong. She told him that was rare. Most people looked at her and saw what she wanted them to see: a wealthy woman, a businesswoman, a philanthropist who donated to hospitals and attended charity galas. They saw the surface and never thought to look beneath it. But Daniel had looked. Daniel had seen something, even if he could not name it. And that made him interesting. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. He asked her what she wanted. She smiled and said she wanted nothing. She was simply observing, learning, evaluating. She had built her empire by understanding people, by knowing their strengths and weaknesses, by predicting their actions before they made them. Daniel was a piece on a board she had been playing for decades, and she was simply trying to figure out where he fit. The door to the holding area opened, and Sarah entered. She told Daniel that Elena's lawyers had finally arrived, a team of 7 from the most prestigious firm in the city. They had filed motions, made calls, applied pressure at levels that went far above the station's authority. Elena Vance was going to be released. There was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Elena stepped back from the bars and smoothed her coat, as if she had merely been waiting for her car to arrive. She nodded to Daniel, a small gesture that carried the weight of their conversation, and she walked toward the door. But before she left, she paused and turned back. She told Daniel that this was not goodbye. She told him that their paths would cross again, because fate had a way of bringing interesting people together. And then she was gone, swept away by her lawyers and her guards and the invisible machinery of her power. Daniel stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty cell. He thought about Chief Morrison, about the fear in his eyes, about the terror that had stopped his heart. He thought about Sarah's words, about the empire that Elena had built, about the web of influence and control that stretched across the city like a net. And he thought about Elena herself, about the way she had looked at him, about the way she had spoken to him, about the question she had asked. "Are you a good man?" He still did not know the answer, but he was determined to find out. The days that followed Elena's release were strange and quiet. The investigation into Chief Morrison's passing continued, but it had lost its urgency. The federal agents filed their reports and moved on to other cases. The department appointed an interim chief, a bland bureaucrat named Phillips, who seemed more interested in avoiding controversy than pursuing justice. Life returned to normal, or at least to the appearance of normal. But Daniel could not let go. He had seen something in Elena's eyes, something that both terrified and fascinated him. He began his own investigation, working off the clock, gathering information that no one else seemed interested in. He tracked property records, financial transactions, business partnerships. He built a map of Elena's empire, though he knew it was incomplete, knew that he was seeing only a fraction of what existed. Sarah helped when she could, feeding him leads and contacts from her years working organized operations. She warned him that he was playing a dangerous game, that Elena Vance was not someone to be trifled with. But she also understood his need to know, his compulsion to understand the woman who had turned his world inside out. They worked together in secret, meeting in coffee shops and parking lots, sharing information in whispers and coded messages. What they found was both remarkable and terrifying. Elena's organization was not like anything they had encountered before. It was structured more like a corporation than a traditional criminal enterprise with clear hierarchies, defined roles, and strict protocols. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, always as a last resort. Most operations were entirely legal on paper, buried beneath layers of legitimate businesses and holding companies. The illegal activities, the gambling, the loans, the protection, were handled by subsidiaries that could be cut loose at any moment, leaving the core organization untouched. The genius of it was the integration. Elena had woven her empire into the fabric of the city itself. Her companies employed thousands of people. Her donations funded hospitals, schools, community centers. Her influence reached into every level of government, from city council members to state legislators to federal judges. She was not a criminal hiding in the shadows. She was a pillar of the community, hiding in plain sight. If you are watching this, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment with the words, "Some empires are built in silence." This phrase will stay with me, and it will help me understand what this story means to those who experience it. Daniel realized that taking down Elena would mean taking down half the city. It would mean exposing politicians who had accepted her money, executives who had signed her contracts, officers who had looked the other way. It would mean burning everything to the ground and hoping that something better would rise from the ashes. And he was not sure he had the courage to strike that match. 6 weeks after Elena's release, Daniel received a phone call. The voice on the other end was soft and measured, and it took him a moment to recognize it. Elena wanted to meet. She had a proposition, she said, something that might interest him. She named a restaurant in the Gold Coast, a place Daniel could never afford on his salary, and told him to come alone. He knew it was a trap. He knew that walking into that meeting could mean walking into his own grave. But he also knew that he could not refuse, that his obsession with Elena had grown too strong to resist. He told Sarah where he was going and made her promise to come looking if he did not return. Then he put on his best suit and drove to the Gold Coast. The restaurant was elegant in the way that only old money could achieve, all dark wood and white tablecloths and hushed conversations. Elena sat at a corner table, dressed in black, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked different than she had in the holding cell, more relaxed, more human. She smiled when she saw him and gestured for him to sit. They talked for hours. Eleanor told him her story, or at least the parts of it she wanted him to know. She had been born into poverty on the South Side, the daughter of immigrants who had worked themselves to death in factories. She had watched her parents sacrifice everything for a dream that never came true, and she had vowed that she would never be powerless, never be at the mercy of forces she could not control. She had built her empire from nothing, clawing her way up through a world that did not want her to succeed. She had done terrible things, yes. She had made choices that haunted her in the quiet hours of the night. But she had also created something that mattered, something that gave people jobs and hope and a chance at a better life. Daniel listened without interrupting. He wanted to argue with her, to point out the victims, the people who had been hurt by her operations. But he could not deny the complexity of what she was describing, the shades of grey that existed between black and white. She was not a monster. She was something more complicated, something that defied easy categorization. When she finished, she leaned forward and made her proposition. She wanted Daniel to work for her. Not as a corrupt cop, she hastened to add, not as someone who would ignore crimes or bury evidence. She wanted him to be exactly what he was, an honest officer who trusted his instincts. She wanted him to work inside the department, to identify threats to her organization before they became serious, to give her advance warning of investigations and raids. In return, she would give him information, leads on cases that had nothing to do with her operations, criminals who deserved to be brought to justice. It was brilliant, Daniel realized. She was offering him a way to be both a good cop and a useful asset. He could arrest people, close cases, build a reputation as someone who got results, and all the while he would be feeding her information that kept her one step ahead of the law. It was corruption, but it was corruption that looked like heroism from the outside. He should have said no. Every principle he believed in, every oath he had sworn, demanded that he refuse. But Elena was watching him with those whiskey-colored eyes, and he felt the pull of her gravity, the seduction of her logic. She was offering him power, influence, a chance to do more good than he could ever do as a simple patrol officer. All he had to do was compromise, just a little, just enough to keep her trust. He asked for time to think. Elena nodded and said she understood. She told him she would wait, that she was a patient woman who knew the value of difficult decisions. She paid for dinner, pressed a card with a phone number into his hand, and disappeared into the night. Daniel drove home in a fog. He sat in his apartment for hours, staring at the card, thinking about everything Eleanor had said. He thought about Chief Morrison, about the fear that had killed him. He thought about Sarah, about the years she had spent chasing shadows without ever getting close to the truth. He thought about the city, about the people who lived and worked and struggled beneath the weight of forces they could not see. And he thought about himself, about the man he wanted to be, about the question Elena had asked him in that holding cell. Are you a good man? The answer, he realized, was not simple. Goodness was not a fixed state. It was a series of choices, made again and again, in moments of clarity and moments of doubt. He could choose to refuse Elena's offer, to remain pure and powerless, watching from the sidelines as she continued to expand her empire. Or he could choose to accept, to wade into the grey waters of compromise, hoping that he could do more good from the inside than he could ever do from the outside. He did not sleep that night. He paced his apartment until dawn, turning the decision over in his mind like a stone in his palm. By the time the sun rose, he had made his choice. He called Sarah and told her everything. She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. She said she understood. She said she did not blame him. She said that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become one yourself. Daniel called the number on Elena's card. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting. He told her he was in. The months that followed were the strangest of Daniel's life. On the surface, nothing changed. He continued to work his shifts, to patrol the streets, to file reports and attend meetings. But beneath the surface, everything was different. He had become a double agent, serving two masters who demanded loyalty in equal measure. Eleanor was true to her word. She fed him information that led to arrests, prosecutions, convictions. Daniel's career began to rise. He was promoted to detective, given access to cases that had seemed untouchable. His colleagues saw him as a star, a prodigy who had found some secret key to success. Only Sarah knew the truth, and she watched him with eyes that grew sadder with each passing week. The information flowed both ways. Daniel told Elena about investigations, about surveillance operations, about witnesses who were cooperating with prosecutors. He never lied, never fabricated evidence, never did anything that would directly harm an innocent person. But he knew that his information was being used, that people were being warned, that operations were being adjusted. He was keeping Elena safe, and in doing so he was enabling everything she did. He tried to justify it to himself. He focused on the good he was doing, the criminals he was putting away, the victims he was helping. He told himself that the net effect was positive, that he was making the city safer even as he protected its most dangerous resident. But the lies grew heavier with each passing day, and he found himself drinking more, sleeping less, avoiding his own reflection in the mirror. Eleanor sensed his struggle. She began inviting him to dinners more frequently, not to discuss business, but simply to talk. She shared stories from her past, memories of her childhood, dreams she had once had before the world had beaten them out of her. She was not trying to manipulate him, Daniel realized. She was trying to connect, to find some human contact in a life that had become defined by power and paranoia. They developed something that resembled friendship, though Daniel knew it could never truly be that. They understood each other in ways that no one else could, two people who had made impossible choices and learned to live with the consequences. Eleanor told him that he was the only person she trusted, the only one who saw her as a person rather than a symbol. Daniel did not know whether to be honored or horrified. The balance held for almost a year, and then everything fell apart. It started with a name. One of Elena's lieutenants, a man named Victor Reyes, had grown ambitious. He had begun skimming from operations, building his own network, positioning himself for an eventual coup. Elena had known about it for months, but she had been patient, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came when Victor made a mistake, when he reached out to an undercover federal agent, thinking he was a potential buyer. The FBI had been building a case against Victor for weeks. They did not know about his connection to Elena, did not realize that he was merely a branch of a much larger tree. But they were planning a raid, a coordinated strike that would take down Victor and everyone connected to him. And if that raid happened, it would expose trails that led directly to Elena's core operations. Daniel learned about the raid 2 days before it was scheduled. He faced a choice that would define everything that came after. He could warn Elena, allowing Victor to escape and the investigation to collapse, or he could stay silent, let the raid proceed, and hope that the resulting chaos would finally bring Elena's empire down. He thought about it for hours. He thought about Chief Morrison, about the fear in his eyes, about what happened to people who failed Elena. He thought about Sarah, about the years she had spent fighting for justice, about how disappointed she would be if he chose to protect a criminal organization. He thought about Elena herself, about their conversations, about the strange bond they had formed. In the end, he made his choice based on something simpler than principle or pragmatism. He made his choice based on who he wanted to be. He did not warn Elena. He did not call the number on the card. He simply waited, sick with anticipation, as the hours counted down toward the raid. The night before the operation, Elena appeared at his apartment. She had never been there before, had always insisted on meeting in public places where she controlled the environment. But there she was, standing in his doorway, her face unreadable. She knew, of course, she had sources. Everywhere, people who fed her information from every corner of the city. She knew that Daniel had learned about the raid and chosen not to tell her. She knew that he had betrayed her trust, broken the unspoken contract that had bound them for nearly a year. Daniel expected anger. He expected threats, ultimatums, perhaps even violence. But Eleanor simply looked at him with those whiskey-colored eyes and asked him why. He told her the truth. He said he could not keep lying to himself. He said he had tried to believe that he was doing good, that the compromises were worth it, that the ends justified the means. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger. He had lost himself in her world, and he needed to find his way back. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the saddest smile Daniel had ever seen. She told him she understood. She told him that she had always known this day would come, that Daniel was too honest, too principled to survive in her world indefinitely. She told him that she did not blame him, that in some strange way she was proud of him for making the choice he had made. But she also told him that there would be consequences. Not from her, she hastened to add. She would not harm him, would not send people to his door in the middle of the night. But the raid would fail. Victor had already been warned by other sources, had already disappeared into the wind. And when the dust settled, questions would be asked, connections would be made, and Daniel's involvement would come to light. She was giving him a chance, she said. A chance to disappear, to start over somewhere else, to build a new life away from the wreckage of the old one. She had prepared documents, money, a plane ticket to a city far away. All he had to do was take them and go. Daniel looked at the envelope she held out to him. It contained everything he needed to escape, to leave behind the mess he had made and begin again. It was tempting, more tempting than he wanted to admit, but he knew that running would mean admitting defeat, would mean confirming that he was exactly the corrupt cop everyone would believe him to be. He pushed the envelope back toward her. He said he would stay. He said he would face whatever came, would accept the consequences of his choices. He said that he had spent too long running from who he was, and it was time to stop. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, took back the envelope and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned and told him one last thing. She told him that he was a good man. The raid happened the next morning. It was a disaster, just as Elena had predicted. Victor was gone, his operations scattered, the evidence destroyed. The FBI blamed the department blamed the FBI, and everyone looked for someone to hold responsible. Daniel's name came up within weeks. Internal Affairs began asking questions, pulling records, connecting dots that formed a picture no one wanted to see. Sarah tried to protect him, tried to explain that he had been gathering intelligence, working toward a larger goal. But the evidence was too damning, the pattern too clear. He was given a choice: resign quietly or face prosecution. He chose to resign. He turned in his badge, his gun, his identity as a police officer. He walked out of the station for the last time with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation in ruins. The story might have ended there: a disgraced cop, a failed investigation, a criminal empire that continued to thrive. But fate, as Elena had once told him, had a way of bringing interesting people together. 6 months after his resignation, Daniel received a visitor. He was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, working odd jobs, trying to figure out what came next. The knock on his door came late at night, and when he opened it, he found Sarah standing, there with a folder in her hands. She had continued investigating Elena after Daniel left. She had worked alone, in secret, gathering evidence that no one else would touch, and she had found something that changed everything. Victor Reyes had not simply disappeared. He had been eliminated, his body found in a warehouse on the south side, his identity confirmed by dental records. But before he passed, he had been talking. He had told the federal agent everything he knew about Elena's organization, had provided names, dates, account numbers, enough information to build a case that even Elena could not escape. The agent had been ready to move when Victor disappeared, but the information had not been lost. It had been recorded, stored in a secure location, waiting for someone with the courage to use it. Sarah held out the folder. Inside were transcripts, financial records, organizational charts. It was a roadmap to Elena's empire, detailed and damning and absolutely authentic. With this information, they could finally bring her down. Daniel looked at the folder for a long time. He thought about Elena, about their conversations, about the strange connection they had shared. He thought about the people her organization employed, the communities it supported, the complex web of good and evil that she had woven. He thought about what it would mean to destroy all of that, to burn it to the ground and hope that something better would rise from the ashes. He thought about the question she had asked him, about the answer he had finally found. "Are you a good man?" Yes, he decided. He was. And a good man did the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it meant hurting someone he cared about, even when the consequences were impossible to predict. He took the folder. The next 2 years were the longest of Daniel's life. He worked with Sarah, with the FBI, with federal prosecutors who could not believe what they were seeing. They built the case piece by piece, interviewing witnesses, tracking money, assembling evidence that painted a picture too clear to deny. Elena fought back, of course. Her lawyers filed motions, her contacts applied pressure, her organization did everything in its power to derail the investigation. But the evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, the paper trail too clear. Slowly, inexorably, the net closed around her. Daniel was called to testify. He sat in a federal courtroom, facing the woman who had once offered him everything, and he told the truth. He told them about the holding cell, about the dinners, about the information he had shared, and the choices he had made. He did not minimize his own culpability. He accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledged that he had been compromised, admitted that he had failed to live up to the oath he had sworn. Eleanor watched him from the defense table, her expression unreadable. When he finished testifying, their eyes met, and he saw something there that he had never seen before. It was not anger or betrayal or hatred. It was acceptance, perhaps even respect. She knew that he had done what he believed was right, that he had followed his conscience even when it led him to betray her. And in some strange way, she seemed to understand. The trial lasted 3 months. In the end, Elena was convicted on 47 counts, enough to ensure that she would spend the rest of her life in federal prison. The judge called her the most sophisticated criminal, mastermind he had ever encountered, a woman who had built an empire on the backs of those she exploited. Elena said nothing in her own defense. She simply stood, accepted the verdict, and allowed herself to be led away in handcuffs. Daniel watched her go. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. He felt only a profound sadness, a grief for everything that had been lost, for the woman Elena might have been if circumstances had been different, for the relationship they had shared, that had ended in betrayal and ruin. Sarah found him outside the courthouse, standing in the rain. She did not say anything. She simply stood beside him, silent and present, as the drops fell around them like tears. The city changed after Elena's conviction. Her organization crumbled, its members scattered, its assets seized by the government. Some of the legitimate businesses survived, reorganized under new management. Others collapsed, leaving thousands of people unemployed. The politicians and executives who had been connected to her faced their own investigations, their own trials, their own reckonings. Daniel became something of a celebrity, though he did not want to be. He was the cop who had brought down the empire, the man who had infiltrated Elena Vance's organization and emerged with enough evidence to destroy her. People wanted to interview him, to write books about him, to turn his story into movies and television shows. He refused them all. He returned to law enforcement. Eventually, though not as a police officer, he joined a federal task force focused on organized activity, using his experience to help identify and dismantle criminal networks across the country. He was good at it, better than he had ever been on patrol. He understood how these organizations worked, how they thought, how they protected themselves, and he was driven by something more than duty, by a need to make right what he had helped make wrong. Sarah stayed with the department. She was promoted to captain, the first woman to hold that rank in the history of the Chicago police. She never talked about her role in Elena's downfall, never sought credit for the years she had spent gathering evidence in secret. She was content to work in the background, to make the city safer one case at a time. They remained friends, Daniel and Sarah. They met for coffee once a month, reminiscing about the old days, sharing stories about their current cases. There was something unspoken between them, a bond forged in the fire of their shared experience. They had both been tested, both been forced to confront the limits of their principles, and they had both emerged, scarred but intact, determined to be better than they had been. Elena wrote to Daniel once about a year after her conviction. The letter was brief, matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. She told him that she did not blame him, that she had always known their arrangement could not last forever. She told him that she hoped he had found peace, that he had answered the question she had asked him so long ago in that holding cell. She signed the letter with just her first name. Daniel kept the letter for a long time. He would take it out sometimes, late at night, and read it by the light of his desk lamp. He thought about writing back, about trying to explain what he had felt, about apologizing for the betrayal that had ended her empire. But he never did. Some things, he realized, were better left unsaid. Years passed. Daniel grew older, his hair turning gray at the temples, his face lined with the marks of time and experience. He rose through the ranks of the task force, eventually becoming its director. He was respected, admired, sometimes even feared, but he never forgot where he had come from, never forgot the choices that had shaped him, never forgot the woman who had asked him if he was a good man. He retired at 62, settling in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, far from the city that had defined his life. He bought a cabin by a lake, spent his days fishing and reading and watching the seasons change. He had found something that had eluded him for most of his career: peace. One autumn afternoon, he received a call from Sarah. She told him that Elena had passed in prison quietly in her sleep. There would be no funeral, no memorial, no public acknowledgement of her passing. She would be buried in a federal cemetery, her grave marked with nothing but a number. Daniel hung up the phone and walked down to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. He stood there for a long time, thinking about Elena, about everything she had been and everything she had done. He thought about the empire she had built, the lives she had touched, the fear she had inspired. And he thought about the question she had asked him, the question that had haunted him for decades. Are you a good man? He was, he decided. Not perfect, not pure, not free from sin, but good in the ways that mattered. He had made mistakes, had compromised his principles, had walked in the grey space between right and wrong, but in the end, he had chosen to do what was right. He had chosen to face the truth, even when it was painful. He had chosen to be better than the man he had been. The sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel turned and walked back to his cabin, his footsteps quiet on the fallen leaves. Behind him, the water reflected the fading light, beautiful and serene and utterly at peace. Not knowing she led the whole crime empire, the cop arrested her by mistake. The next day, the chief vanished. But in the years that followed, something more remarkable happened. A man found his conscience, a woman faced her fate, and in the space between justice and mercy, two lives touched and transformed each other forever. Some stories end with heroes and villains. This one ends with something more complicated. Human beings, flawed and beautiful, making choices that define who they are. In the end, that is all any of us can do. We choose, and in our choices we find ourselves. If you have watched this far, it is because this story touched something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or see the world a little differently, please give it a like and share it with Someone who might need to hear it. Every like, every share, every subscription helps this channel grow and helps me bring you more stories like this one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for believing that stories still have the power to change us. Until next time.